I look at it this way. For centuries now, man has done everything he can to destroy, defile, and interfere with nature. Clear-cutting forests, strip mining mountains, poisoning the atmosphere, overfishing the oceans, polluting the rivers and lakes, destroying wetlands and aquifers. So when nature strikes back and smacks man in the head and kicks him in the nuts, I enjoy that. You know something else I like? Those spring floods in the Midwest. Aren't they great? Like clockwork. Spring floods in the Midwest. But I'm starting to notice, I'm starting to catch on, that every year it's the same story. Another flood in the same place with the same people on the same river. Same fucking people! And these people do not move. They will not fucking move. They repaint, put down new carpeting and wallpaper, and they move right back into the same fucking house on the floodplain next to the river, and then they wonder why grandma's floating downstream with the parakeet on her head. Fourth time. Again. Fourth fucking time. There's no learning curve with these people.
Why is there no such thing as a natural disaster? Because it's up to us as people and societies to prevent them. Disasters are caused by vulnerabilities, not hazards, with people's vulnerabilities usually caused by others who tend not to experience the vulnerabilities or disasters directly. This means that nature, through the hazards, does not cause disasters. So disasters do not come from nature. Disasters are not natural. The phrase natural disaster really doesn't make sense. It is a misnomer and should preferably be avoided, just calling them disasters. Disasters are caused by choices about vulnerabilities, mainly creating vulnerability for others over the long term. Given that not everyone can understand design calculations or legal documents, if your house collapses in a landslide, tornado, or flood, who set the building codes? Who monitored and enforced any regulations? And who provided information that you could comprehend in order to make a decision about living there or not? All these processes require people with the power and resources to do the job properly, and they require time to implement. Consequently, disasters are not sudden, swift events happening in a specific location at a specific time. They are long-term, slow-moving, social processes. Some environmental events appear rapidly, such as tornadoes and landslides. Disasters take a long time to manifest, even if only apparent when a sudden hazard appears, such as the house collapsing in a tornado or a landslide, because it was inevitable that collapse would happen at some point due to the design, siting, and construction. The disaster results from humanity's decisions, attitudes, values, behavior, and activities over the long term. All disasters happen slowly. Overall, dealing with nature is not that challenging, provided that we focus, do it properly, and sustain our actions over the long term. The choice is ours. Now, this does not mean blaming people who lose their lives and property in disasters. They do not often deserve to feel guilty for what happened to them. The real perpetrators of disasters are those who create and maintain the social processes leading to vulnerability. Factors creating the unnatural disasters cover physical aspects of individuals, so examples are age, gender, and state of health. Also aspects of society, such as demography, economics, cultural norms, crime, corruption, the built environment. The reasons why vulnerabilities are not overcome relate to ideologies, governance, prejudices, assumptions, resources, power relations, and availability of choices. This does not remove individual responsibility in cases where people have choices and resources, yet they still select vulnerability, which could be living in a floodplain to enjoy being beside the sea or beside the river. It does mean recognizing that vulnerability arises from a balance between options for oneself and imposing options on others. Delving into the nature and causes of vulnerability makes it clear that people are not inherently vulnerable to hazards, but they are made vulnerable by societal and individual choices.
And I certainly didn't think anything could be done. It was, after all, a natural disaster. We had no way to warn the people. The killer here was not the tsunami in itself. It was not nature's wrath. It was lack of information, lack of an early warning system to let the people know, do not run towards the ocean, run away from it. As we look closely on again and again, there is nothing natural about any of these disasters. Natural hazards do not become disasters unless or until people are affected by it. And in most cases, these are the poor people who live in the most vulnerable settings with no preparedness. For example, we know that 80% of Bangladesh is in a floodplain. We know that. If flood happens year after year, you may wonder why people still live there. Because floodplains are the source of some of the most fertile soil, so people will move back there to farm. But what if we can tell a poor farmer in Bangladesh that there will be a flood a week before that happens so he can prepare, so he can anticipate? And we can. We can run flood models which will show us where the river will flow and when the flood will happen. But the real question is, how can we get this information into the hands of the farmer who needs it the most?
Learned is that nearly all of the trauma and tragedy we call natural disaster is not only predictable, it's preventable. Disasters are 100% a result of poor human decision-making. Incredible advances in mapping, modeling, and atmospheric science have given us 7 to 10 days notice of a hurricane's landfall and allowed us to predict, often to the individual house, how much damage we should expect. Flood modeling is so robust that days in advance, we can predict on what day, at what time, and what locations we expect rivers to overtop their banks. And even more amazing than our ability to predict a specific event is our knowledge of how natural hazards affect communities and what we can do to prevent the damage. To show you what I mean, let's take a deeper look at Houston and Harvey. Houston is the largest US city with no formal zoning. And between the late 90s and Harvey, it was also one of the fastest growing. At its peak, 275 people moved to Houston each day. And with all of those people came the need for housing. Houston accommodated by paving over more than 30% of the wetland and prairie, and trading naturally absorbent land for impervious houses, driveways, and roads has consequences. Rainwater can't rapidly absorb, instead, it funnels, collects, and floods. More than a decade before Harvey, a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers report mapped locations in Houston that would experience catastrophic flooding in significant rain events. But developers, together with city officials, willfully disregarded that known risk, calling wildfires, heat waves, hurricanes, and flood natural disasters obfuscates our human responsibility. It lets us off the hook for the death and destruction.
So I was in the Washington Post, for example, in December, I think, of 2019. And then afterwards, I got a letter at some point from the German state media authorities, and they asked me to take down 3 of my most influential videos, and they wanted to fine me, I think like 1,000 euros for it, because I was talking about climate change skepticism, and apparently that is a threat to the, quote, climate-friendly movement. What this really is about is that they don't want me to talk about controversial topics, which is climate change, obviously. And you're called a climate change denier if you're a skeptic. And that's ridiculous because, first of all, of course climate change is real. And I hate it when people ask me, do you believe in climate change? Because yes, the climate change has been changing for billions of years. The question that we ought to ask is climate change man-made? And is there a causal relationship between man-made CO2 emissions and climate change? And this causal relationship has never actually been established. The IPCC only works with climate models, and what you also need to know is that the main greenhouse gas is water vapor. 60% of the impact is generated by water vapor, and then the rest is mostly CO2, but only about 3% is man-made CO2. So does this really have such a huge impact on the atmosphere, on the climate, when there are so many other factors like the sun and clouds? And so the idea is that you have to take into account the positive and negative feedbacks that increase or decrease the greenhouse gas effect that you would have just in a normal lab experiment. And what the IPCC with their climate model says is that there are so many positive feedback responses that you have a very high climate sensitivity, which means that the greenhouse gas effect is even stronger in the atmosphere and much stronger than would be in a normal lab experiment. So they overestimate this greenhouse gas effect massively. And that is only based on factors that they pick and choose themselves for their climate models. And the climate models have failed before their predictions have failed, and they did not adjust the factors.